All right, hello. All right, glad to have you. So let's see here. Let me get your names down and I will make sure that you get your extra credit. All right, so thank you for coming. This is the longest um, assignment that we have. You notice it's 19 pages, which is a little ridiculous, but it's just quite a subject and there's just so much to write about and talk about. So I'll do my best to give some bit of depth, but balance it with reasonable brevity. And so we're not here forever. All right. So I'm going to jump right into it. Okay. I'm going to share the screen with the assignment. So with number one, right, when you are doing court history, you can't deny us fighting the Spanish-American War, us acquiring the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba for various spans of time. You can't deny that, right? And being acquisitive like that as a country, you probably have heard the term imperialist, and that's not a good word. That's usually used as a bad word, and it always has been. And so we became an overseas imperialist at this time. And so you can't deny that, especially with places like Hawaii that we still have. So the best thing you could do is try to justify our intentions, right? Our motivation, our motives, our reasons for becoming an imperialist power, all right? So number one is it tries to justify why we became so aggressive in our foreign policy, contending, right, that the ideas, it really highlights the role of ideas, okay? And historians, they disagree about how pivotal ideas are. Because for instance, like Marxist historians, right, they think everything is about economics and power, money, resources, and power. And so they don't put a lot of stock in the role of ideas, at least to them, right? They think ideas are undergirded by a desire to maintain power and exploit people, etc. So at any rate, with number one, it's kind of a more romantic, about as romantic as you can get as far as U.S. taking over other territories, contending that we felt almost compelled, right? We felt almost forced, coerced, pressured into becoming an aggressive nation state, all right? And so for one, is like I mentioned, as I just mentioned, is the role of ideas, okay? At the end of the century of the 1800s and the 1890s in particular, right? There were ideas that were percolating and that supposedly, and this is arguable, were making their way down from academia to the masses, right? Because the average person still wasn't going to college, wasn't reading Friedrich Nietzsche, etc. But yet his and others' ideas were making their way through various medians or means to the masses. So what are some of the ideas? Nietzsche said that the modern man was becoming sickly from his own success. There had been people who had postulated kind of a cycle with empires that they start and they have the eye of the tiger, right? They're hungry, they're primitive, they're warlike, they're aggressive, and they do well, and they conquer decadent empires, right? And decadent, I mean morally decadent, right? Where they become soft, immoral, choosing comfort and pleasure over progress, and they get soft and they get taken from the throne. And then supposedly, right, those hardy, barbaric people, once they make it to the top, they become civilized and they appropriate a lot of the culture and a lot of the institutions and practices of the very people that they conquered. And then they, in turn, become decadent. And someone hungry as they had been before overthrows them. And that's kind of where Nietzsche was coming here, is he believed that mankind was in his practices, in his institutions, and in his mindset and behavior, he'd become decadent. He'd become too soft, and so forth. And that to him, it especially had been the cause of Christian morality, which he equated to slave morality, being meek, being humble, loving your enemies, etc. Nietzsche, was not for any of that. And so he wanted people to go back to their barbaric, roots, with creativity, with aggression, etc., and get away from the soft cities, etc. Then you had people like Spencer and Huxley, who really made Charles Darwin's theory applicable to society. Because remember, he was dealing with biology and animal life, right? And they brought it to the social and societal realm, and contending, right, of kind of like with his notion of survival of the fittest. That, remember, with Darwin, a lot of it was by chance in his mind, that you happen to be born with a lucky, useful mutation that gives you an edge over your competitors, your peers. With Spencer and Huxley, they made it more volitional, more of a thing of choice, rather than something that you're born with. And they stated that all nations have, and all peoples in aggregate, together, collectively, have a choice to embrace that which is amenable to their survival, right? And what's amenable to their survival? First of all, develop a strong military, right? Have a strong military, and have embrace technology, as far as novelty in technology, of course. Embrace the second great industrial revolution. Okay. Embrace representative or republican form of government, etc. To them, those things were helpful in your survival as a country, okay, as a people. And they were contending that if you fell back, you could get gobbled up and not survive. You literally, as a country, as a society, as a civilization, can become extinct in the history books. Then you had people like Houston and Gobineau, right? Houston, Chamberlain, and Gobineau. And they contended that countries were going to end up fighting it out one day in kind of a Mad Max sort of dystopian end, right? And they were getting this from another scientist. Oh, goodness, I can't believe his name is eluding me. I know I have to have it in here somewhere, but I don't have time to read for it. But Malthus, there he is. So this guy right here, Malthus, right? He was concerned that society was growing exponentially, right? So 2 to 4, and instead of 4 to 6, 4 to 8, instead of 8 to 10, 8 to 16, 16 to 32, and so forth. So he said, the population is growing exponentially, but it's going to outdo how many resources we have for the world. And so hence there's going to be a great battle, this sort of Armageddon, if you will, between peoples throughout the world for water, for oil, etc., for food and scarce resources. So Gobineau and Chamberlain stated that different, quote, races were going to do it. And that they hinted that, of course, their, quote, Caucasian or white European race had the edge and should win in that fight. And because, when you look at the accomplishments of the second industrial revolution, when you look at the technological developments of navies and armies, right, and militaries, Western Europe and the United States were kind of at the forefront. So what they did is they used these so-called sciences and these, ideologies to justify that as to why they were on top, and because they had made the wise decisions. And then some, yes, even use so-called science in contending that Caucasians were further evolved using Darwin's theory of macro species evolution, as if there's not one human race, but that different people, that some ethnicities, some quote races came from Neanderthals, some came from Australopithecus, et cetera, as if we're literally different species. And of course, that doesn't hold water at all when they get to the anatomy and DNA studies today. That doesn't hold water at all, I believe. But yet this was the so-called science of their day. So they felt like they were biologically superior. They were culturally superior, but they said, right, it was far from inevitable or unavoidable that they would win. They still had to make decisions to do so, to win. So for one, right, is they contended with Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan was an American. A lot of these gentlemen that I've mentioned were not. So a lot of these ideas came from Europe. But Mahan, right, he contended that you have to make good, what's the word? Preemptive, right? Remember, preemptive is that before your opponent punches, you make defensive and offensive maneuvers in anticipation of what he's going to do. So you have no problem in a preemptive strategy to strike first, to be aggressive. You're trying to gain the advantage before your opponent even makes a move whatsoever. So Alfred Thayer Mahan stated that it was imperative for the United States to preemptively grab certain, which he called geostrategic positions in the world. And to me, right, this is kind of like a chessboard. When you look at the globe and you take a look at that globe and say, okay, let me see if I have a map anywhere close here. I should have, but I may not have. Yeah, like you see here, right? And you think, okay, here we are as the US. I wish this were a better one, though, and would illustrate the entire, huge Pacific Ocean that's over here. And so you think, okay, what are the likely dangers? Who are the likely foes that we have to worry about? And like England, like France, for various reasons, we often thought Germany at this time, because Germany was taking off, had been unified in 1870, and was just taking off industrially, militarily in the 1870s and moving on from there. And so we said, okay, Germany, right? Where are they going to come hit us if they do? So we tried to preemptively, right, grab spots where we could have naval yards with our Navy ready in the Caribbean, off the South American coast, out in the Pacific, etc. And our fears were quasi-confirmed when Germany tried to take the Samoan Islands in the Pacific Ocean. And we almost went to war with Germany over it. And people were saying, see, I told you Germany is the threat. So that's what Alfred Thayer Mahan stated, is that it was imperative for people, for the United States in particular, to gain an influence, was the euphemism he used, an influence in certain areas of the globe. So the problem with that, though, right, is that it was assumed that you don't take no for an answer. So what happens if you say, okay, Dominican Republic and Haiti, right, the island they share in the Caribbean, we feel it's imperative that we keep a naval station here off of one of your countries. And what happens if they say no? And it was assumed that you first, you pulled a Rockefeller, basically. You first tried to bribe them with a quid pro quo bargain. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, right? And then if they said no, then you began to extort them, right? To threaten something, and oftentimes it was economic. Threaten something on them if they did not cooperate. Okay, so that happens, and Alfred Thayer Mahan supposedly had a really good relationship with the people that you see in the red right there: Charles Beutel, Henry Cabot Lodge, James G. Blaine, okay, Cushman Davis, Benjamin Harrison, who would be the president, Benjamin Tracy, etc., Theodore Roosevelt. These people read his book on the influence of sea power and absolutely just broadcasted their support for it, and that they believed it, and that the U.S. ought to follow it. And so it's not a coincidence that in 1883, our Congress, for the first time in quite some time, agreed to spend $1 billion in the budget to develop a new steel navy. Okay, and philosophically, for one thing, that was different besides the obvious, guesses that you could make with technology, with a naval battleship, is, for one, its ability to traverse the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Believe it or not, for a lot of the early to mid 1800s, our ships were not built in mind to traverse those entire oceans, especially the vast Pacific. Matter of fact, our critics called them the mosquito coast, or the coastal mosquito fleet, that they were puny, they were pathetic, and that they were intended only to guard the coast. Because I think I want to say I'm sure I'm going to be wrong. I want to say it's 10 miles. There's a certain by international law distance from the shores of each country that you go out, and up to that point, it is technically out in the ocean, the territory of that country, whose coast it hits. But yeah, I want to say 10 miles, but it may not even be that. And so they just did that. And so now with this new Navy, right, and the ships were named after states. This goes all the way, you guys, until World War II, with the Pearl Harbor attack. So the USS, Iowa, Oklahoma, etc. And so they developed a much more offensive-minded Navy in 1883. But remember, they're contending that it is imperative, it is necessary for us to do so. And then you also have things that happened that helped reinforce these beliefs that were percolating in the 1890s. Survival of the fittest. If you're soft, you're gonna die out. You have to be aggressive, et cetera, et cetera. We had an episode with a guy named Balmaceda, who ruled Chile. We had a couple episodes with him where he humiliated our Navy. And then we also had an episode with Germany, where we almost went to war with them in the Samoan Islands. And everyone was saying we were not ready. And thank goodness we did not fight Germany at that time. So you see, to some people, they're saying, see, I told you, this is what it is. You have to be aggressive in this Darwinian world that we're living in. And then lastly, right, is then you had because notice everything that I'm saying, right, was a justification to be selfish, right? To put America first and be aggressive on behalf of American self-interest. And there was no apologizing for it, right? Now they added in the 1890s an altruistic, a humanitarian component to the recipe. And it was known as collectively as the white man's burden, right? And it stated that if we got involved in, quote, third world countries in Latin America, in the Caribbean, out in the Pacific, who were, quote, backward in their culture, that they were heading toward oblivion anyway. So it's actually in their long-term best interest for us to, at least temporarily, take them over, take what we need from them, but also civilize them, convert them to Christianity and save their souls, give them an education program, teach them proper modern government, participatory or democratic government, help their economy modernize, etc. All right. And of course, along with that, we're like the missionaries who were, as a lobbyist group, were wanting America to get into some of these, quote, third world countries so they can go and save souls and help them do just that. All right. So at any rate, that's number one. All right. Contending that it was our feeling of necessity to get more aggressive and so forth. And as an example of such, I do a little bit of great man history and mention Teddy Roosevelt. Okay. Then number two, speaking of great man history, remember, that doesn't mean that you think the person is a great man or woman. It just means that you believe historical conditions moved in a certain direction because of people in power and their decisions, their personalities, etc. So with great man history, President Grover Cleveland and William McKinley were hesitant bullies, right? So look for evidence of that, okay? Look for evidence of them having pretty valid excuses, justifications for going to war in Cuba and in the Philippines against Spain, okay? And choosing not to do so. So as you probably know, Spain from the 1500s, right, took over not only Latin America, with the exception of Brazil, which belonged to Portugal, and Haiti, which belonged to France, and Jamaica and Barbados and Trinidad belonged to England, but so much else in the Caribbean and in Central and South America was colonized by Spain. As you may know, from the early 1800s, the first two decades of the 1800s, they gained their independence from Spain. Spain was taken over by Napoleon, and there was a vacuum. There was no one on the throne, so to speak, in Spain, at least no one that anyone acknowledged. They weren't going to acknowledge Napoleon's brother. And so they took advantage of that in Latin America, and they declared their independence, right? Well, it happened virtually everywhere, except for Puerto Rico and Cuba. Okay, they stayed under Spain all this time up to the 1890s. And then, as you may know, in the 1500s, there was a great rat race in Asia for spices and all that, right? And at that time, Spain grabbed the Philippines as well and held on to it all up until this point. So almost simultaneously and feeding off one another in the 1870s, and it failed. Then again in 1895, these three countries of Puerto Rico and Cuba in the New World and Philippines and Asia declared their independence from Spain. And Spain wasn't just going to let it go. The liberals, right, in Spain, they wanted to grant certain rights and participatory power to the people of these colonies. But even they were not for just letting them go. They thought that the dignity of Spain, the revenues for Spain could not be lost, that no one, seriously took that as an option. The conservatives, of course, wanted to put these island people in their place, right? And so they fought for 3 years, and it was bloody and drawn out. It got ugly. Guerrilla warfare. I remember guerrilla is like when they put ia as an ending in Spanish, or ito, it's diminutive. And so guerra is war. So guerrilla warfare is little warfare. They fought without uniforms. They blew stuff up. They attacked, supply lines. People that were aiding one side or another, they burnt their place to the ground. It just got nasty. And so Grover Cleveland stayed out of it. Going out of office, he stayed out of it. But William McKinley is going to ask eventually Congress to declare war against Spain to help these three countries out. Okay. But the point is even McKinley was long suffering before getting involved. So you have things like the lobbyist efforts by these people, by these island people. Not so much the Filipinos and not even so much the Puerto Ricans, but the Cubans sent a lot of leaders to Florida and the east coast of the US to try to gather money, sympathy, a US declaration of war to help them, or volunteers to help them in their cause of a free Cuba, of a Cuba Libre, free of Spain. And at El Galeon, certain leaders of the Cuban rebellion decided that it was in their best interest to burn down plantations of dual citizens, of those who were both citizens of Cuba and citizens of the US, because they figured that it would be a way of manipulatively drawing the US into war, because the US wouldn't want to lose that money. Under the 5th and 14th Amendments, the Constitution states that the government, the federal government, is obliged to protect its citizens' property. What does that mean overseas? Well, it's differed according to whichever administration is in. And so they were hoping that they would, that could help pull us in. And again, Grover Cleveland said, nope, not going to do it. Then yellow journalism. This depicted the Spanish with their atrocities as devil-like, right? And how they treated the Cuban people. And as you see there, Spanish General Valeriano the Butcher Weyler became the press's #1 villain as he implemented the reconcentración policy. He would go into areas out in the the forests, the heavily forested areas of Cuba, and if he didn't feel like a given village or city was loyal to Spain, he'd put them all under house arrest, or put them all under arrest, and massively put them in these camps. And some of them were starving and dying of disease, etc. And you can see just emaciated bodies of prisoners who had done nothing wrong, right? Just simply for being Cuban. And Weyler didn't trust their loyalty. And so the press had a field day with this, right? And so at any rate, the US still wouldn't get involved. All right. So notice this is still court history, #2. It's contending that we were a hesitant bully. We didn't want to fight. We were pushed into it. All right. And then, right, with the president that's the enigma, oh gosh, McKinley. This guy was something else, right? He was a puzzle of a man. When people would go after him in Congress, he would refuse to go there. And when he had dirt on other people, when he had vicious things he could have said about them, he just wouldn't do it. And they knew he was classy that way. When he was assassinated, he literally, before he died, forgave the guy who shot him and told his bodyguards to quit beating the guy up, and said that he was worried about his poor wife who had bad social anxiety, and used him like a safety blanket and he was always very just sweet with her and chivalric with his wife. And he was voicing concern about what was going to happen with her with him gone. So you have that side of him, right? And then you have another side of him that is he's a Republican candidate who oftentimes sided with the rich time and time again in one policy, domestically or foreign. And then we're going to get to another part of that. But at any rate, remember that according to the historians in the 1890s, there was a spirit of the age called the zeitgeist. There was a spirit of the age, right? That was heavily influenced by Darwin's theory that you have to be tough, you have to be aggressive, or you're going to get gobbled up in this world, right? And he was a surprising person to win as president during that decade because he was not manly. He didn't evoke that image. He was not tough, etc. And so at any rate, he already came in with that handicap. And then there was a Delomé letter. And Delomé had written to another Spanish ambassador that he was not worried about the U.S. getting involved in fighting Spain to help these island people out in their independence, because he said the U.S. president has no backbone. Well, somehow that letter was confiscated and given to the press, and the press ran with it all over the country, saying that Spanish key diplomats are calling out our president as a coward, as a spineless man, wimp. And so he had that kind of pressure on him to get tough with Spain. Okay. And then in addition to that is you had the Maine, the USS Maine. There was a bullfighter of world renown who just at the height of this tension came from Spain to Cuba, of all places, to Havana for a bull show. And when all this tension was going on, kind of like, Olympics with, China and China, like when the Tibetans were saying free Tibet, etc., right? The Cubans tried to use it as an opportunity to get world sympathy when the Spanish bullfighter came to their country. So as they were protesting outside the stadium, the Spanish government just smashed down on them, came in with their clubs and did mass arrests, beat them, beat masses of people, et cetera, et cetera. And there were some, of course, who were dual citizens, who were technically American citizens that were badly beaten and thrown in jail. So finally, supposedly, right, President McKinley says, all right, I'm going to at least send a message. I'm going to send the USS Maine into Havana. Just let it sit there at port to remind the Spanish that Americans are watching them. And as you may know, it was there about 6 weeks, a little over a month. There were a couple occasions in which the Spanish even came there at the dock to the American ship and introduced themselves to them. And they were brought into the ship and they dined with the Americans as a diplomatic gesture of goodwill. But then after about 6 weeks of that kind of weird tension, it blew up and it killed over 100 American sailors. The Americans, right, send a scuba diving team down under. The Spaniards send theirs. And I kid you not, we found evidence of an inward explosion at the hull of the ship that illustrated that suggested that it was a mine that someone had placed on the outside of the ship and blew into the ship, right, from a foe. And the Spanish looked at the part of the one of the generators of the steam engine and found evidence of an outward explosion that was accidental from the steam engine. So they claimed it wasn't their fault. We claimed it was, right? Congress was furious. The press ran with the Maine, and the American soldiers have been killed, over 100 of them by the Spanish, right? And even then, President McKinley said, I don't propose to be swept off my feet. He still would not declare war or ask Congress to. And there was one occasion in which a senator stood up and announced, we will declare war without him if need be. And that was without President McKinley's approval or support. So that is the degree to which you could read court history, right, that tries to defend our country and its leaders regarding our president. Then, however, number 3 morphs into a more revisionist history, right? More cynical, more critical. It says, this guy was a puzzle. He was a puzzle. So for one, right, is how did he get us involved in the war? He got us involved in a way in which he easily was intelligent enough to perceive that that was almost inevitable. Almost, it was unavoidable the way he did it, that he was going to get us involved in this war, right? And for a guy who was so hesitant, you would think he would always want to keep a window or a door open, right? For an alternative route to maintain peace. What is that inevitable thing he did? Is he granted Spain an ultimatum, okay? And this ultimatum stated, you have, I don't remember, I want to say it was 3 months. Ivan Musikant's book has the exact time frame, and I forget. Empire by Default by Ivan Musikant is a great book on this, on the Spanish-American War. But at any rate, McKinley states, you have a certain amount of time, Spain, to either end this war or to come to terms with these 3 countries, right? Or we're going to get involved. Well, they've been fighting, you guys, since 1895. Now it's the spring of 1898. So if Spain can't militarily defeat these rebels in 3 years, what made him think that Spain could do it in 3 months? And then secondly, he had every reason to know from the juntas, the committees that were brought here from Cuba to Florida, he had every reason to know that the Cuban rebel leaders, right, were not going to accept any terms short of complete independence from Spain. They made that very clear. And he knew that even the Liberal Party, under a guy named Projeres Sagasta in Spain, that now took over, was not willing to just completely let go of its colonies. So how could they come to terms, right? The Cubans said, no way, nothing, no compromise short of completely letting us go. And the liberals in Spain in control said, there's no way we are just letting go of Cuba or the Philippines or Puerto Rico for that matter, right? So at any rate, this ultimatum, it looks to some historians as if it is an excuse to get us into war, because there's no way out of it. It was pretty much inevitable once he issued this ultimatum that we were going to go to war with Spain. So for a guy who was trying to avoid war, that's ironic, right? But then secondly, right, is while the Cuban leaders had made it clear that they wanted U.S. assistance, the Filipinos and the Puerto Ricans did not. So with the Filipinos, right, I don't know the Tagalog language. I'm going to butcher this, but Katipunan was their organization led by Emilio Aguinaldo, and they did not ever officially ask the U.S. to intervene in the Filipino rebellion. Okay. So, matter of fact, as the US had kept its naval fleet in the Philippines or near it, there was a gentleman in charge of the Navy, as well as a diplomat, who both of them, spoke with Emilio Aguinaldo, and Aguinaldo contended till his death that both promised him that the US, if we were to help them, would give them their independence once we helped them win against Spain and kick Spain out. So he contended that for the rest of his life. And as you could easily guess, cynically, that's not going to happen. And he's going to end up having to fight us next because we refuse to leave his house. So at any rate, that's the case generically with the Philippines and Puerto Rico, right? Sagasta offered a compromise set of terms, okay, known in English as the Autonomy Decrees. It was likened by Ivan Musikant in his book to Great Britain's status under, Canada's status under Great Britain, right? That in some ways domestically autonomous, independent, but in other ways, especially with foreign policy, Great Britain runs Canada. So something of that sort was offered to these three countries, right? Well, guess what? One of them, the Puerto Rican leadership, accepted them. So why do we need to help the Puerto Ricans fight against Spain when they agreed to terms with Spain that they would stay under Spain, but have limited autonomy, right? And guess what? President McKinley states that we're not only sending soldiers to Cuba to fight Spain, we're sending them to the Philippines, where they have not been invited, and we're sending them to Puerto Rico, where they said they're okay with staying under Spain, to forcefully help them be liberated from Spain. So again, you know what I mean? For a guy who didn't want to fight, now he's starting to show signs of a secret imperialist, right? Who's coveting these lands. And remember also that he's a Republican, and he's a big business Republican. And a lot of the big businesses could not wait to open up the markets of the Philippines and in the Caribbean, etc. All right. Yeah, look at those are the words of Katipunan in the Philippines. That American offers to, quote, help may constitute an insincere desire to put American, quote, claws into that string of islands. Hence, the Filipinos, by and large, did not ask for U.S. help or intervention, but President McKinley sent troops there anyway. Then, in addition to that, Katipunan established the Malolos Constitution. And the Malolos Constitution was modeled after the United States Constitution. So as far as the rhetoric of that time, remember we talked about this on number one, how, you know, the idea of being caught up with new changes and novelty, with technology, with military stuff, but also, right, with government, with political science, having representative government with checks and balances, written constitutions. So the Malolos Constitution should have absolutely impressed the United States. And we said, no, don't be silly. You're not ready for that type of self-government. And we established a much more ironically primitive, archaic government. We allowed their local cabildos that the Spanish gave them, their local city councils, to continue to exist. But then at the regional level, we had almost like 3 governors in each of the regions of the major islands of the Philippines. And those three, right? One could be a Filipino elected by his people. Two of them were Americans handpicked, whether the Filipinos wanted them there or not. Then they had a Congress established or parliament established in the Philippines. The lower house were Filipinos who were elected by their constituents, right? But the upper house was a small group of handpicked Americans. And they had to, quote, collaborate with each other to pass laws. So Americans kept a very limitedly Republican or limitedly Democratic government, and very kind of paternalistic government, right? Where we were like the father figure in the Philippines. But those are the two gentlemen right there. Commodore Dewey and Spencer Pratt were the two gentlemen that supposedly had given assurances to Aguinaldo that we had no intention of staying there at the end of the war. And as you may know, that's a great book, by the way, Bound to Empire by H.W. Brands, Our Imperialism in the Philippines. A great book. But as you probably know, we are not going to leave the Philippines and let them have their own independence until the end of World War II. That's McKinley. And then number 4, okay, I'm going to speed up a little bit, okay, because we've gone so long. The title says it all. This is kind of Marxist history. U.S. pursuing its economic interests, even at other nations' expense. So note here, I try to give examples, right, of diplomats who were put into their positions and seemed to be almost obsessed with doing the bidding for American businesses, right? The euphemism they used was opening up markets in China, in the Philippines, in Korea, etc. Then the poor Chinese, when we were exploiting them economically, they contended, right? They had a Boxer Rebellion. And we sent troops to help the Chinese government squash it. We had designs on Haiti. So we helped a rebellion in Haiti. After the rebellion, the gentleman was supposed to have responded in kind, in gratitude, right? By granting us the concessions we wanted. And he turned on us after we had armed and helped him. And we almost invaded Haiti over it. And a few European countries warned us not to. And then another person that shows a horrible side of America is Walter Lefebvre. As you see here at the bottom of the top of the footnotes, Walter Lefebvre has several books on US imperialism in Latin America, and a lot of it is informal imperialism, right? Like formal is just taking over a country, right? And literally declaring the type of government, having Americans in key positions of power, like we did for a while there in the Philippines. But informal is just buying up most of their land, extracting most of the wealth from the country, building railroads through their land, et cetera, et cetera. So he gives lots of evidence for American informal imperialism in Latin America. So the United Fruit Company, a guy named Samuel Zemurray, who was called the Banana Man, just bought up most of the land in Nicaragua, in Honduras, Colombia, and Panama are railroads and canal companies. Then, of course, the Panama Canal, right? And then we engaged, just like we said that the Europeans should not do, we engaged in gunboat diplomacy. And gunboat diplomacy was you deliberately have your major banks come in and lend money to not just private investors and the leading businessmen of Nicaragua, of Chile, whatever country it is, but to the government itself. And then when it goes into derrieres of repayment of the debts, you threaten violence, right? You come in and you start off by you say, okay, well, we are forcefully putting a person into your government who helps write your budget to ensure that so much of your annual budget goes to paying back that loan to Bank of America or whatever it might be. And it was just one way, another way of just kind of manipulating, controlling these countries. And number 5 is I try to end on a positive note, right? I try to give some benefit of the doubt to the American government by looking at the money, the manpower, the resources that were put in to, quote, improving some of these colonies that we took over for a limited time. So namely what we're talking about are, as I mentioned, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Although Cuba was only 4 years and we let go of Cuba. We still have Puerto Rico, as you know. And remember, I try to remind you of number 1, of the ideas that were percolating, right, at this time. So I try my best to look at the glass half full and say, well, Americans had some good intentions, right? Because after all, look how much they changed. Look how much they did. The liberals of their time period, we're going to get into next, were the progressives, right? And a lot of liberal progressives in academia were excited about these 3 colonies, particularly the Philippines. And they put their money where their mouth was. A lot of them gave their money and gave themselves and their time traveling to these countries to teach and to lead, etc. What they believe to be an act of philanthropy, right? So take a look and see what you think. Of course, by today's standards, it's ridiculous paternalism, right? It's a ridiculously high level of paternalism. But I'm trying to suggest that, but in their defense, they really believed this. They really believed they were helping, equipping, preparing, empowering these colonized people. All right. All right, so are there any questions?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Could you explain a little bit more what you mean by paternalism?
Sure. So paternalism, right, is just, I mean, the assumption that like a father figure, you were in such a primitive state, right? An immature state that like a child, you don't yet fully know what is in your own best interest, what is best for you. But I do. And I not only know what's best for you, but I'm willing to exert the resources, the effort, the time uh, to help you. Right. And so, you think of it now, as I've mentioned before in class, right? It's such a huge movement that we had in the 1800s that we don't even realize how pivotal it was in shaping our lives today was classical liberalism, right? With that John Stuart Mill. And it's basically, right, like you do your thing, I do mine. And you decide what's best for you. I'll decide what's best for me. We'll coexist. And the only boundary we'll put up is the boundary of you not interfering with my natural rights, you not harming me, and me not doing the same to you. And then we just coexist. And you have your gray areas where you wander, right? Like if you're trying to go to sleep before going to work and someone's blaring his radio as your neighbor, with his constitutional right to enjoy his music, but yet it's getting loud and late. There are always vague areas where we're trying to, at the local and other levels, decide where the boundaries are. But we still agree that basically, until it becomes controversial or harmful, we do our own thing. And they didn't have that back then. They hadn't had, that really take into effect. And so they really believed, right? I mean, imagine seeing someone here in today's, venue, and you tell them, hey, take that cigarette out of your mouth. That's bad for you. You could die of lung cancer, and you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that, or tell someone who's driving recklessly when you get to the stop sign or the stop light, hey, you're going to continue that, you're going to kill yourself or someone else. And you believe and perhaps know that you have objective facts behind your assessment to prove that you're right, and that it really would be in his or her best interest to listen to you. But we just take for granted, right, in this society, that it's not our business to do that. But they did that here. That was very paternalistic of them, right? As they said, Filipino people, you don't know what's best for you, but we do, and we're going to show you, and we're going to lead you. So does that help at all?
No, it definitely does. Thank you.
No problem. All right. And so, yeah, thank you guys for coming. I have you all down, and you'll certainly get your extra credit. All right. Thank you for your patience with grading too. It's been crazy at my two schools, and it's just, that's no excuse, but I plan on catching up. All right. So I'm proud of you for that. And if you guys don't have any other questions, I'm finally done.
Thank you, Professor.
All right. Thank you. So you guys have a nice week. Okay.
Okay,
You too.
bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye.
You too.